Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. Today is Wednesday, July 21st, 2021. I'm your host, Marty Bennett. And over the next 30 minutes, we're going to be answering three questions we've been hearing from international educators this past week. First up, is this Chinese student lawsuit political theater? Will Hope College's Hope Forward work? And finally, should rankings remove testing data from criteria? So we'll answer those three questions and more in our roundup today. And if you're wondering where we get the themes we have each week for the roundup, look no further than our weekly newsletter, all the SMIE news fit to share, and that stands for social media and international education news. That newsletter comes out Mondays at 9 a.m. Eastern. You can subscribe for free using the link on the latest edition of the newsletter that I'm dropping in the Facebook comments section for this post. Or you can go to our SMIE Consulting website at smieconsulting.org/subscribe to see all the past editions of the newsletter, as well as links to how you can subscribe to our podcasts if you like to download the roundups each week for your listening pleasure, or watch them on repeat on YouTube or Facebook. So thanks very much for being a part of the SMIE community, and we look forward to helping you find answers to some of the questions you have about international education these days. So up first, we have a new lawsuit that's been filed, or I shouldn't say filed, it's planned to sue. Over 1,000 Chinese students plan to sue the U.S. for visa restrictions, and they fear extension to the arts and businesses. And this is out of Global Times, and this is one of the kind of mouthpieces for the Chinese Communist Party in terms of what we're talking about here. This is if you've kept up with our roundups in the last couple of weeks, we've focused on some of the Chinese students that have been either put into administrative processing because they are graduate STEM students that are still under the guise of the Trump administration presidential proclamations that took exception to the students applying from institutions or had family members who were part of the PLA or police forces or those types of things in China. That's part of the military-civil fusion strategy that China has adopted to work its way into research and scholarly positions and student positions in STEM fields to potentially steal technologies and intellectual property law. We've talked about that here on the Roundup. So this lawsuit is something that they are the opening line to this article tells you everything you need to know about kind of the tenor of where it's coming from. Over 1,000 Chinese students decided to cast away their illusions and file suit after they found that despite the U.S. Embassy in China reopened to process visa applications in early May, strict restrictions on those with high-tech backgrounds remain in place, and such restrictions are extended to those applying for studying literature and business. So this is the piece that we talked last week about STEM. What are we going to do with Chinese STEM students because of the regulations or the presidential proclamation from the Trump administration that have not yet been dismantled, and with some good reason, for fear over intellectual property theft and technologies being stolen. These are the students that are being targeted are, according to this article, and in probable reality, are mainly from 8 Chinese leading science universities, which have always been U.S. targets, as they believe to have links to the Chinese military. So there's the only link really that's talking about that military-civil fusion strategy that we've mentioned before. So those are restrictions that are, again, targeting graduate STEM students. And again, it's a much smaller, graduate STEM students are the initial target, as we talked about last week, but that target was reduced to those with coming from institutions that have PLA ties and civil military fusion ties. And that's the It's not just for STEM; it's also for other fields. And it was, and this case is from students from these institutions that the U.S. government has targeted as having these military ties that are out to steal information. And there are cases pending in the U.S. This is not news, and it shouldn't not be news to any international educators that these cases have been going on. And have made their way through courts and all of these things. And they're being, the individuals that have been caught here in the U.S. are being caught for basically lying about their ties to the military in their visa applications and when they went for their interviews and all of that. So these are students from 8 schools, and you wonder, obviously, if they are Chinese students organizing like this against a foreign entity. You know that's not happening on its own, and you feel fairly comfortable that if these students are coming from these 8 institutions that supposedly, according to this article, have ties to the military and thus the Chinese Communist Party, that very much so this is in reality an act of theater, what I'm calling political theater. So it's a way to stick it to the U.S. Again, and the legacy of Trump living on, and that the impression that China wants to hold on to that as long as possible. And it messes with their world domination plans through soft power and all of the things that they've been doing over the last 10 to 15 years. So this is something that's a group of 1,000, and 1,000 sounds like a lot, and certainly in the scope of the number of Chinese students in the United States, where there are over 300,000 in the U.S. On student visas, this is a drop in the bucket. And frankly, if it's a focused approach by the U.S. government to target students from institutions that do have these ties, and China will never admit to that, obviously, but that they don't get organized all by themselves to propose a lawsuit. And I don't know who they're filing a lawsuit against the U.S. government, and where they have standing to have that case heard. That's something that I don't see this case ever making it anywhere near a courtroom, but in terms of what would have to happen in order for a case to be heard like this. So it's an attempt to paint the U.S. as this big bad ogre again, denying the hopes and dreams of Chinese students. And again, these aren't just high school students. These are graduate students who have been at institutions studying for a bachelor's degree, looking for advanced degrees in the U.S. or other countries as well. And that's certainly is something that I think won't get as much attention here in the U.S., but certainly in China, that's fodder for the mill there in terms of stoking negative impressions of the U.S. When it comes kind of dissuading potential Chinese students from studying in the U.S. The reality is, from all the surveys we've been seeing over the last 6 to 8 months, Chinese students are still very much interested in the U.S., and that parents are much more practical and realistic about their children's options, particularly at the undergraduate level, for where they want to study. So certainly the corner has been turned. It's not the tap is wide open again in any case, but certainly I think the future is still strong for U.S.-China relations. And on the higher ed front, politically there will always be contentiousness going on between the two governments. There's talk of a new Cold War, and it's being with primarily China, but also Russia as well, in terms of the whole disinformation campaigns and social media bots, and that have taken over a lot of social media discussions and influencing political elections. We've heard all about that, but certainly with regard to what we're talking about with this lawsuit, again, I think it's political theater. It's never going to go anywhere. The U.S. government has its right to review cases that they think are threats to national security and deny visas purely at their discretion. And that's not something individual students have control over. So if they want to study in the U.S., they have to jump through our hoops, just as students that want to go study in China have to jump through their hoops if they want to do that. And right now, those that want to study in China can't actually get into the country and haven't been able to since February of 2020. So international students who want to be in China to study at their universities have certainly not gotten the Welcome Mat rolled out for them recently since the pandemic, and certainly no signs of them opening up anytime soon for international students. So it's a little bit of pot calling the kettle black on this one for China to be refusing entry for international students who want to study in China, but the U.S. is doing the same for national security reasons as opposed to health and safety reasons that the Chinese government has. Governments have that right to do that and control who they let into the country. So purely political theater as far as I'm concerned with this lawsuit, threat of a lawsuit, whatever it might be. So on to something much more positive with our second question. If you're in higher education in the United States, particularly have feet in the financial aid world, certainly if you're a parent of a student that's applying to colleges in the U.S., you've heard of, you know, all the challenges with student loan debt, with increasing prices of colleges and universities that are far outpacing the rules here with regard to the costs and outpacing inflation and all of these things. So one college in Michigan has begun a new campaign that is a very different take on how to approach higher education funding, and it's Hope College in Michigan. And it's a Christian college in Michigan that is in Holland, Michigan. That's famous for their tulips in the spring. The president introduced this in his inauguration in September of 2019, and the Board of Trustees has just approved it as of January, where the goal is, it's called Hope Forward. And the goal of this plan is to, as the president says, we're excited to be pursuing a new model for funding higher education. Rather than require students to pay for their education in advance through what is too often a transactional relationship, we are working towards a funding model based on the biblical principles of generosity and gratitude. Once it's implemented, students will receive a transformational education for which others have paid. Then, when they are graduates, we will ask them, out of gratitude for what they've received, to be generous in response by investing in future generations of students. And my goodness, could you ask for a more radical transformation of how higher education is conducted? And he makes the case clearly that it's part of their mission as a Christian institution, and I certainly get that they want to make it available to all students, not just those from wealthier backgrounds. But they also recognize that, as he puts it, the business model of higher education is broken, and we want to pursue a more sustainable framework. And that is something that when you look at the outcomes for what he's envisioning here, they want to enable their graduates to enter their career and communities with a focus on positively impacting the world unburdened by tuition debt. And that's, he's admitting it's going to take many years to see to fruition, but to see this goal is probably taking, and the goal is to raise $1 billion. Their endowment right now at Hope College is somewhere in the neighborhood of, let's see how much we got here in their endowment right now. They're looking at $280 million in their endowment currently. They need to increase that by at least $1 billion to fully fund the program. It's gotten it started this year, I should say, with a gift from an anonymous donor with a certain cohort, 22 students this fall, that their tuition will be fully funded by a private gift, and a similar cohort next year will be funded by that same donor. And he's kind of, the whole concept of this paying it forward approach, Hope Forward, is really gearing it to by providing free tuition. It's not the whole cost of education. You still need to pay for your fees and books and room and board, that type of thing. But this is just earth-shattering. I mean, in terms of a private institution being able to do this, when you see the dollar amounts that they're talking about to increase their endowment $1 billion, right now there are very select few private institutions and some larger state institutions that have that kind of endowment strength in the billions of dollars to do that. And to their credit, they're doing that now, but they're doing it with using the interest from their endowments to fund scholarships for the neediest students. But they are basing it on need, not for everybody. So this is something that I think is a very refreshing concept. Can it be applied to every college and university? Certainly don't think the model is there that would allow that with, like, particularly state institutions. Small regional state universities would probably not have the bandwidth for the funding drives that are necessary. And certainly at a private Christian school like Hope, you have a clientele that's already buying in to, one of the reasons they send their kids to a school like Hope is because of the mission of the institution and in terms of a Christian focus and that. So the broader implications, though I would love to see it happen, or instead of relying fully on a lot of these free college ideas that exist now, particularly free community colleges, the burden falls on the taxpayers to fund these initiatives through the state and local governments. It's not national funding for this. So it's really interesting to see where this is going to go. With the plans for this, it's certainly a beacon of hope, I think, no pun intended, for students and from an international perspective. And talked to my colleague at Hope, Jim Crawley, who's been heavily involved in NASA for many years, leader there. He's also indicated this is for international students. It's literally going to be for all students. I don't think any are going to be involved in this initial cohort this year or next year, but in the long run, if this happens, it would make available this Hope Forward process of free tuition to all students who attend the college. So that's something that I think is what an incredible marketing tool that is going to be for the institution in terms of expanding their pool when it's fully functional. It's not there yet, obviously, but it's a thought and a goal that is certainly an out there goal. It's a big goal out there that you want to have those kind of visionary leaders at your institution if they're willing to back it up, and if the university community, the university alumni community are behind this, and I hope they are, then that bodes well for the future. And we're talking $1 billion for a small college, private college. That's a lot of money, but to do it, and if they're able to do that in the next 10 to 15 years, what a remarkable accomplishment that would be, and signal perhaps a turning point. And you can see a lot of other private colleges certainly paying very close attention to how this project goes, because it obviously changes the dynamic and changes the model completely for how institutions are funded. Basically, it would be, in this case, it's alumni and private donors that would be funding future students' educations at Hope, because their graduates and alumni, eventually all graduates, would be able to pay it back to the institution that had paid it forward to them initially to allow them to achieve their goals and to achieve their career objectives. So really excited about what this might mean for higher education in the United States. Again, a very different model, and certainly one that I don't see applying to every college and university, and it's one that I think has such great merit, and to hold your hold yourself as an institution up to some higher standards, which I absolutely approve of. But also changing the culture on the campus to actually start living out your principles as an institution, as a Christian institution in particular. And I think that of paying it back, of having a life, living a life of generosity and gratitude, and what that looks like is that money is the love of money is the root of all evil, but as the Bible says, not love of money. Money isn't the root of all evil. The love of money is, and that's something that I think when you look at your life, if you haven't had to pay 4 years of a private school tuition, which could run $30,000-$40,000 a year for many private schools, if not more, and then be able to over time pay that back to future students and to help pay it forward for their lives. That's just something that you can feel confident knowing that you're living your mission out, living your principles out that you learned as a student there. And so I really love the confluence of how you live your life and how putting your principles into action being manifest in what this institution is trying to do. And I think it is going to break the model if the current model, business model, because it clearly is already broken, and it's going to give a very stark alternative to how institutions can manage and fund their students and fund education. So great, kudos to Hope for going down this path. I wish them all the best with that. And certainly they set a fine example for other institutions that might have similar challenges, frankly, and issues of being responsible and not having students leave their institutions with such huge debt. There's obviously some of that's self-induced, that families that want the value of the education because of what they think their degree will be worth, that they're willing to take on that debt, but then there's also the responsibility, you got to pay that debt back. Make it less transactional, as this president has said, and make it one that's much more living out of your principles that you espouse as an institution. So kudos to Hope, and we'll certainly be keeping our eyes on how that goes. Now, on to our final question. For those that have followed our newsletter for the last year or so, test optional has been an increasingly important focus of the news stories we see coming in each week. And it's test optional for, it's what started initially as test optional for SAT, ACT. That certainly accelerated dramatically during the pandemic in terms of what students were going to be required for fall 2021 entry. That many schools have extended their initial trials of a year to 2 or 3 years. Some of, like the University of California system, have done away with testing altogether, standardized testing, other than English language proficiency. But you also see testing options, testing optional debates covering graduate school exams like the GMAT and GRE. So, and increasingly seeing more institutions going that route to not require those, beyond just having pandemic-related implications for why they're not requiring them. But we now have the test optional movement with also impacting rankings organizations. So we all know U.S. News and World Report. Many of us in the U.S. grew up making our college lists that touched on some way or another what U.S. News and World Report had for rankings of institutions, whatever that might be. What we have, a new group coordinated. This is called New America, a liberal research organization that has rallied 11 organizations, including NACAC, to the cause of removing test scores from rankings criteria. And this is, as calling it rather simply, the right thing to do. And this is something that I certainly think from an international perspective, this is obviously for covering domestic admissions and the rankings that U.S. News are available for domestic and international audiences. But the value of testing internationally for standardized testing is, as when you think about some of the criteria that those that have called for making schools to go test optional in the last year, even before this year, they would say it's for because it's disadvantaging students from minority communities or lower income communities who don't have the advantages in terms of the study options, the study preparation, the education in general to prepare well for the SAT or ACT in terms of what are required on those exams. You now have, and certainly internationally, you look at what those tests test you on, and they're testing particularly on the English language skills. They're testing students on who have learned, they're designed for students who have learned American English in a U.S. high school in the United States. And the majority of international students if they've learned English, it's likely been in a British system school overseas in probably a different, their own national language or their own national system school, or perhaps a British language school or British system school. So really, for me, international students should should not be required to take SAT or ACT. All institutions I've worked at have made it optional for international students. But I'm comforted to see in this, they don't make particular reference to international students in this, but they do talk about the value of test blind and test optional policies for institutions. We've just seen an article this week come out regarding University of California that since they've gone now test blind in the last year, they now have the most diverse pool of admitted students that they've ever had, and they tie that specifically to removing SAT and ACT from the equation. So it's interesting to see, and that was always one of the reasons many schools decide to make that switch, to diversify their applicant pool and admitted students and eventually enrolled students because of the bias that they see as existing in the tests themselves towards students from minority and low-income communities. So very encouraged that this group is asking U.S. News, a group of 11 organizations, to remove rankings or remove test score results from the ranking criteria that are established, not to abolish the rankings altogether, but just to eliminate eliminate that as a criteria, test scores as a criteria for how they determine rankings. U.S. News declined to comment on this story, but they have said in the past that SAT and ACT scores count as about 5% of the value of the rankings for the last group, the last rankings they did in the fall. So it's interesting to see what happens. Though U.S. News has said that they're going to include, they've not said how they're going to include those schools that are test optional in their rankings, but they are, because there's so many more than there were a year ago. I think they're going to be put in a position where it's going to make sense that there needs to be an accommodation made here. So it really encouraged that NACAC, certainly leading this charge, Angel Perez, the CEO of NACAC for the last year and a half, 2 years, that it's been asked, they've asked U.S. News to do this since 2008 to remove test scores from the rankings. NACAC's asked the group 3 previous times to drop test scores as well. Back then in 2008, when it was first requested, U.S. News said it would change its rankings if a meaningful percentage of colleges dropped the SAT-ACT requirement. So I think we're certainly at that point where a meaningful performance. That's this past year, you've seen the lion's share of colleges and universities drop the requirement for SAT, ACT because of the pandemic, but also some seeing the pandemic as covered or make their policies permanent for eliminating test scores as a requirement. So we'll see where this leads, but there's some real interesting waves being made by some of the higher ed community associations, and we'll certainly bring any news along this front to you as it becomes available. So until next week, friends, we encourage you to keep fighting the good fight and live out your principles in your daily lives, as Hope College is trying to do coming up. So until next time, have a wonderful week. Cheers.